Welcome to our webinar today entitled Best Practices for Assessing Current State and Building a Strategic Roadmap. My name is Dan Barford with Terillium. We'll go into some introductions, but before we do that, just wanted to make sure everyone was aware of how to ask questions on the Zoom app. There is a Q&A panel down at the bottom that you can open up, and it will give you the option to type in a question, which we'll address at the end of the session. Once again, too, we are recording this, and so that will be available and will get emailed out tomorrow morning. Today's speakers, so like I said, my name is Dan Barford. I've been in the J.D. Edwards Oracle space for 26 years. I've been at Terillium for 22 of those years. I focus on the project delivery side of things, so helping customers with strategic discussions around their ERP and other enterprise applications. With me today is Bryan Rose. I'll let you introduce yourself, Bryan.
Thanks, Dan. Hey, guys. Bryan Rose, 12 years with Terillium. My background is really to help organizations like yourself to transform and become more efficient, leveraging technology, and where that starts a lot of time with understanding where you are today and then building out what the strategy is for the future. So looking forward to today's topics.
All right. Thanks, Bryan. So the agenda we're going to cover is we'll do a little bit of an introduction to the topic. We'll talk about the importance of assessing your current state, then dive into what those key steps are in the assessment process, which will build up to the point where we'll talk about building a strategic technology roadmap, how to prioritize those things, what it means to approach it as a phased implementation. And then we're going to close on some best practices. And then because Release 25 for J.D. Edwards is relatively new, we're going to touch on a few of those enhancements as we conclude the presentation. So, like we've said, we're going to cover some topics today that explain why it's important to conduct a technology assessment and how that can help build a strategic roadmap for your organization. Why is this important? Well, with the change in technology, the rapid evolution in changing technology, it's important to have a plan that allows your organization to adopt and leverage advancements. Companies like Oracle, they are investing in this technology and adding that functionality to their ERP, their database, their cloud services. So as we set the stage for this presentation, it's important to ensure that there's alignment between business objectives and IT initiatives. And that's kind of what that center icon depicts. So we'll touch on that. You know, you don't just want to take on a new IT initiative because of an advancement in technology. You need to have that aligned with what the business has on their strategic roadmap. And then finally, we want everyone to walk away with an understanding of the importance for a long-term strategic plan. With that, I am going to turn it over to Bryan to talk through some of the initial topics here.
Okay. Thank you, Dan. All right. So, guys, ultimately, before jumping into any new type of assessment project, it's crucial to take a step back and review, where you are today. What is your as-is processes? And a lot of organizations I talk to might be wondering why is that so important? After all, shouldn't we be focusing on where we want to go versus, where we are today? But the reality ultimately is if you don't have a clear understanding of your current state, you're really setting yourself up for challenges down the road. So let's talk through, kind of three key areas or reasons why this review is so critical. So the first one is, reviewing that as-is process allows you to identify both gaps and ultimately opportunities. So without having kind of that clear baseline of how things work today, it's easy to miss inefficiencies or problem areas that have become kind of routine to either you or your end users within the organization. So by understanding that the current system, the current processes, you can uncover these inefficiencies, bottlenecks, manual processes that are ultimately slowing you down. So, without this foundation, you really risk putting yourself in a solution that may not address the actual problems, or worse, create new ones. The second is, reviewing your current state allows you to ensure that the future technology investments that you're making are going to align with your organizational business strategies. So it's critical because technology should support your long-term business goals, not just solve some of your short-term problems. When you skip this step, you run the risk of implementing technology that doesn't scale with your business or doesn't help, kind of meet a broader business objective that you have. So by us aligning technology with your strategic goals now, you're making sure that every investment that you make from a technology perspective is a step towards that long-term success. And then lastly, addressing that current state helps you to identify and to ultimately mitigate risks. Outdated systems, security vulnerabilities, compliance issues can often be overlooked if you don't dig into what your current state is today. So once again, by identifying all of these risks earlier on, you can address them before they become bigger problems down the road, which will additionally allow all the stakeholders to be involved in the process, that you drive to a consensus to make sure that everyone is on the same page, avoiding any future roadblocks and risks from an organizational perspective. You can run to the next slide for me, Dan. Okay, so once again, I talked about it a little bit earlier, but many companies believe that, hey, my current process is so broken. Rather skip the assessment. Let's just focus on future requirements, and it might feel tempting at times. But once again, it often leads to more problems down the road. So let's once again talk a little bit more about the as-is state and why it still is critical, even if what you're doing today isn't perfect. It's understanding that current state ensures a smoother transition when you're implementing your future requirements. Without knowing those systems, those processes, the functions, you risk major disruptions within your organization. So even if that current state is flawed, employees are still used to them, right? And any sudden changes can lead to confusion and frustration and a drop ultimately in productivity. So a thorough review helps you to plan and create a transition strategy that minimizes these disruptions and maximizes your employee buy-in. The next one is, targets improvement where it's needed most. So make sure when you're going through these activities, you're targeting the high value or high impact, low effort type of situations, right? So kind of creating that different matrix. So, you're assessing the current state allows you to focus on those improvements where you guys need them most, right? Hey, are we struggling in the supply chain side? Is AP automation a big challenge for us because we're having to manually match all these different invoices, whatever that might be? And by going through your as is, you can determine where are we broken and where can we fix it. So, you going through and understanding your current state gives you those bottlenecks and pain points that you have today, making sure you can improve those and do which ones are going to bring the biggest value to your organization. And then the last one is, you need to make sure that you're having realistic planning when you go through these processes. So when you're reviewing that current state, it allows you and ensures that your future planning is really grounded in reality. So when you skip this step, you're making assumptions on what hopefully will work, which can ultimately lead to unexpected roadblocks, systems that don't integrate, or processes that are harder than what you may have thought. So Dan, if you want to run to the next slide. So when we think about going through a technology assessment, what are the key cogs or key areas that I always try and focus in on when we do these assessments? And it's really broken into kind of 5 key areas, right? So we've got our fact finding, our planning, workshops, which is where the majority of the time will be spent, your analysis and assembly, and then finally, your recommendations to the business. So driving into each of these, the first step, if you decide to go to the next slide for me, Dan, is fact finding. So the best way to think about this is you're gathering as much information you can about the current process, looking at network diagrams, as-is processes, any scripts that maybe you have put together, throughout your implementations or your upgrades. If you have a ticketing system, a great example is, hey, let's go and look at the areas where we seem to get challenges or tickets in over and over and over again, right? So us collecting all of the information of where you are today. Now, this is pre us doing any conversations with people, pre any workshops, but it allows you to get smart on the overarching problems that you have and, the network understanding of, what is where, what third parties do we have, things along that nature. So once we've gone through and did our fact finding, we then roll into our next stage, which is planning. So planning is exactly what it sounds like, right? You're determining who's going to be in the room and who's going to drive these different conversations. And, we talk about this with whether it's project, whether, it's a implementation or an upgrade or an assessment, is this is a key point where you want to bring the A players, right? You want to bring the people within your business who know all the ins and outs, can speak to where they want to go from a strategy perspective to help kind of lead that direction. So you're laying out who's going to be in the room based on what specific areas that we're covering. And then we're starting to talk about scheduling sessions. So scheduling sessions is leading into the workshop phase, which is next, where we are determining and driving through each individual area that is a part of our assessment. So when we think about workshops, this is where the rubber meets the road at the end of the day. So we're going through, and these are interactive conversations, typically when we go through these, where we're sitting in a room and walking through the current state, right? So you have a visual up of your current state, and then you start to pick through where are our pain points, where, do our as-is processes not align with our to-be processes, and you start to build out strategies for what ultimately that looks like, right? So, an example, if I'm going through and maybe we have this broken process today when we're creating bombs where our bombs aren't, managed correctly because we're using external third-party SharePoint and we're not doing approvals with an E1. That's a great opportunity to where our as is broken because our controls are out of place, and we can implement something like ECOs, let's just say, inside of E1 to help create a more formal and process that gives us the data that we need. So these workshops are interactive conversations where you're bringing people in, pulling people from different places within your business to learn and understand what those pain points are. So once we've gone through, we've gathered all of our information, right? We've scheduled our workshops, we've processed through these workshops and determined where our pain points are. Now we have to take all that information in and move to our next phase, which is, really analyzing where we're going to go. Now, some organizations ask me a lot of times, what are the right questions to ask? So when we come in, we have kind of a set script of what we like to talk about. But if you're running this yourself, you may be saying, hey, where do we approach this? What are the challenges that we're going to hit from a topic perspective? And what are some key questions that you always ask? So these are kind of the top 3 different groupings, I would say, right? So we need to think about your pain points today and your challenges around, what is, the biggest areas of you feel like where improvement can be. User experience and adoption, this has become a much bigger deal, especially for organizations that are moving from maybe a world to an E1 or a 9.0 to a 9.2. JD Edwards has become much more user friendly. So you can utilize new tools and technologies like Orchestrator and Compose Pages and notifications and the E1 page search, right? Those are different areas where you can create very high value investments and processes within your business with a really low impact of how you get those implemented. And then you need to think about what your future scalability needs are as well. So if you're an organization and you see yourself doubling in the next couple of years, or you've got a couple of acquisitions in the fold, you need to make sure that those types of conversations are put on the table. So when you're building out this strategic strategy, you're not putting yourself in a corner to where you can't grow with that process. Okay, so like I was talking about, once we've gone through, we've done our workshops, now we're taking a step back and putting all of this information together, right? We're taking all the pain points, we're taking all the current as-is processes, and we're analyzing where do we go from here, right? How do we create a more cohesive process systematically within JD Edwards to be more efficient in our end process? So we're starting to build out our roadmap. We're creating, we have a set of objectives that we've determined throughout our workshops that we're trying to attain. So this is us taking a step back and actually building out what that plan looks like. And when we go in and do these assessments, a lot of times, Dan, if you go to the next slide, we'll kind of try and break these out based on the individual area. So here's a great example of an order to cash example, right? So as you build out your different pain points, you're going to want to understand on the left side, where are the key areas that we're having challenges? And then on the right side, what are some of the improvement opportunities that we can do, whether it's a process opportunity or a technology opportunity within E1, maybe it's utilizing a new module, and benchmarking where you are today versus where you feel you can go ultimately in the future. So building these out based on the individual areas is going to be very important. So you're pointed in where can we improve in the specific areas, and then where we can ultimately go from an organizational perspective. And once we've gotten there, right, we're going to give some recommendations. And you know, you guys going through that process internally, this is you, right, preaching to whoever, you know, from an organizational leadership perspective, you need to get buy-in from to make these individual changes. So you're taking all the information that you learned throughout your workshops, you've built out your technical strategy from a process perspective and a JD Edwards technology perspective, and you are pitching, right, what those recommendations are. So a lot of times when we come in, you know, it's based on how can we reduce third-party footprints possibly? How can we reduce modifications and leverage things like UX1? How can we make an order entry process more efficient by dropping an Excel document in and doing specific updates, right? So this is when you're talking through the strategy of how you get to that end goal. And what that looks like a lot of times is, you know, you have a process maturity matrix of where you are today, similar to what I showed you earlier in the order to cash, but this is more of a summary level where in each of the different areas, where are we now and where do we think we want to go in the future? Same thing from a summaries of opportunities. So if you go to the next slide, Dan, this is showing, and this really helps a lot of times with organizations to, you know, pinpoint where are we having our biggest challenges. So if I were to look at, you know, this record count of the opportunities for improvement, it's pretty clear to me, yeah, we've got issues in a lot of the areas, but order to cash has the lion's share of our challenges. So if we're able to fix the majority of those, we could be in a very good position. So by laying these different summary opportunity visuals out, you can very quickly, from a management perspective, see where those challenges ultimately are. Do you want to go to the next slide? So, and then once you do that, as you're building out your strategy, I would highly recommend you chunk it out. So don't just have a 2-year strategy with lots of high level, long-term opportunities. You're going to want to really start with short-term opportunities that allows you to kind of get the ball rolling, get some momentum within your business, and then start progressing into some of the more medium-term and long-term strategies. So the short-term, the way that I like to chunk these out are short-term are things that we can do within the next month or two, right? Lots of times these are UX1 updates because those are easy to do. New modules at times, things like ECOs are very easy, short-term types of opportunities. And then when you get into the medium term and long term, you know, maybe your long-term strategy is, you know, JD Edwards isn't doing what it should be doing on the supply chain side. We don't have the capability that we need. Let's look at, you know, integrating with a third-party supply chain tool. That could be more of a long-term opportunity, or even, you know, moving to a new tools release. Maybe you're on World and you want to move to E1. That's probably not a short-term activity, right? Because it's a long pole in that tent, but it does kind of create, what are we going to do today? And what is our long-term strategy moving forward? And then my last slide, Dan, if you want to just roll up, this is just more of a visual build out of how I would do it. So you have each of the different chunks individually, but more of a, hey, this is the 2-year project with each of these high level areas that we're going to be focusing in on. So once again, when we think about assessing the current state and rolling through that assessment process, it's really about understanding where you are today, where you want to go in the future, and building the roadmap on how you ultimately get there. So now I'm going to go ahead and Dan and pass it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Bryan. So you can see from the agenda, Bryan kind of took us through the importance of assessing that current state, and then what are those key steps in the assessment process, which was like an end-to-end overview of the assessment A lot of what we're focused on today, though, is preparing for that, right? And then in addition to all the things that Bryan mentioned around the assessment process of gathering the facts, reviewing them, building out some deliverables and opportunities that are the result of going through those workshops. I want to talk a little bit about building out a strategic roadmap and what are some of the inputs to that. So when we talk about a strategic technology roadmap, we're really talking about having a plan that takes technology evolution and aligns it with business strategy. And I like to break that down into three main categories. So starting with your goals, and this aligns with what Bryan just presented with regards to opportunities too. You can put these goals as short, medium, and long term. Not every IT initiative has the same weight and value. Some can be done quicker than others, while some may have little effort but a large impact. So some goals may resonate. Moving to the cloud infrastructure and taking your JDE system off-prem. You might have a goal to consolidate systems and eliminate some outdated technology. We certainly know several of our customers who continue to keep servers running and continue to keep applications running that are long since obsolete, but they're critical to a business process, and so they're keeping them going. And you might want to take a step back and question whether or not that's the best approach at this point. Another goal might be around process improvement, which can often be neglected or avoided because people are worried there is risk that comes with process change. So making sure that you bring the business at ease by helping them understand what sort of benefit that process change will bring helps you get buy-in on that process. And then finally, that last bullet under goals there, you could be looking at building out a global model or what we sometimes call process standardization. So if you have disparate processes across different locations or different companies, but ultimately you're doing the same thing, a lot of these assessments will highlight the fact that with just some basic process standardization, you can now have efficiencies within the organization to streamline things. You have an easier way of onboarding people because you're training them on a process that's familiar across all of these different locations and companies. The next category there is around system updates. So these are things that can also end up on a strategic roadmap. It could include a simple tools release, if you're talking about JD Edwards, or a major upgrade to the latest version, getting code current with your system, essentially. You could be updating outside systems or third-party applications, taking into consideration your technical debt. These are the customizations that you own and you're forced to live with or maintain over time. So understanding how your organization scores within that technical debt category is important when you're looking at a roadmap. And finally, from a system update perspective, you have security, and that can be broken into different categories. Is your system secure from cyber attacks? That's typically determined by how up to date you can keep your servers. A lot of times, how up to date you can keep your servers is depending on what version you're running on different ERP applications. And then the second arm of security is around your end user security. Are you in violation of any segregation of duty rules, or do users have too much or too little access to what they need to do? All things that can be part of that strategic roadmap. And then the final category there, business alignment. We've spoken about this a few times during this presentation. So you want to ensure that your technology initiatives align with business objectives. For example, there's no reason for IT to deploy a paperless warehouse when the business operates with a shop packet, which is key to how they operate, right? If it's critical that something gets handed off from one person to another, a global paperless initiative is probably going to hinder that process and doesn't apply to them. So in that example, IT and the business aren't aligned in their initiatives. If the business intends on making some sort of an acquisition, that will play a factor into the overall IT strategy. And that could be a reason you might want a global model that we spoke about earlier. So you have standard processes that can be deployed quickly in the event that a new line of business comes into play. And then there could be a digital transformation initiative within the organization that could include things like process automation, process efficiency, RPAs, different technological advancements that get introduced to the business via different methods that could be considered part of that business objective. That's probably one of the easiest things to align with IT. You start talking about digital enablers and things that the IT world sees and deals with all the time, aligning that with what the business objectives are a good thing to put on a roadmap and often expedite some of that benefit that you can gain from things like that. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, not every project or initiative is going to have the same weight or the same impact. So this is where we need to take a step back and evaluate all of these different options and create a priority. Again, tying it back to that alignment of the strategic roadmap and the business goals. So when we look at prioritizing things, we look at high value options. So looking for specific initiatives that can provide a lot of value to the organization. Embracing new technology can position the business for digital transformation. Maybe fixing old or outdated processes or looking to enhance or automate business processes, that can have a significant ROI. If the users, going back to the initial discussions around the assessment, if that's some of the pain points that the users bring to the conversation, hey, I'm clicking all of these different things, or I have to manually do this in one system and then go duplicate that effort in another system. Looking for ways to improve that for the users, make them much more productive in their jobs. Another high value option is ERP modules. You might have licensing for or easy access to modules that you own but just aren't currently using. And specifically in the case of JD Edwards, we know how integrated that is. So spinning up or deploying those additional modules tends to go rather quickly when you've already got other components of the system that will easily speak to that new module. And then finally, on the last slide, I talked about technical debt. You want to look to eliminate or reduce customizations that require ongoing maintenance. There are definitely customizations that can be built that can live relatively maintenance free. You don't want to just eliminate those for the sake of eliminating customizations. Those often bring high value to the organization. It's when you've changed the source code or every time you take an update, this customization gets impacted. You want to look for ways to maybe repurpose that customization into a better, easier process to maintain. The next part, ROI can sometimes be difficult to truly measure, but if you take the time to evaluate these different initiatives, you can sort of quantify the ROI as a low, medium, or high impact. For example, owning, maintaining, and staying current on infrastructure can often be a pretty large IT expense. So if you're looking to move some of your enterprise applications to the cloud that you're currently running on-prem, but you don't have the latest and greatest in terms of hardware and infrastructure, that can be a good ROI in terms of getting out of the business of owning and maintaining hardware. It can be worth exploring a cloud or a hosted solution, looking for redundancy within any manual tasks that could be automated. That's usually pretty easy to slap some sort of an ROI on. And then, is the business demanding that IT continue to support systems that are out of date? And in some cases, paying a premium for support that expired several years ago. And then that last one, better data analytics. Do the users struggle to get the information they need to be more efficient at their jobs? So sometimes spending a little bit of money on a better reporting tool or analytics tool returns that value almost immediately. And then finally, from a business alignment standpoint, we've been pretty consistent talking about that throughout the presentation, staying aligned between IT and the business. You want to make sure that these priorities are in alignment as well. For example, is there a current path to the cloud, whether that's hosting or some ERP cloud application? Does the business maintain a policy of staying code current? What does that look like, and how does that fit within the framework of these initiatives that will end up on a roadmap? Maybe there's an ongoing initiative to standardize processes. We talked a little bit about that. Or are you starting to explore artificial intelligence within the organization, or is that something the business wants or is asking for? These are all the different ways that you can determine the right priority. So some examples we talked about in the high value category: changing platforms, going to a more modern platform. Maybe you're on the I-Series now, but you want to go to Oracle's cloud infrastructure, or vice versa, depending on what those needs might be. You're looking to make some process improvements in the areas of payroll or other, adopting the orchestrator. Other examples in the ROI category. So you can easily measure your return by going to cloud. You can look into processes that IT supports that could be outsourced, right? So that IT staff can be more strategic with the organization versus being in a constant cycle of supporting the business. Sometimes offloading some of those mundane support activities free up that team to be a little bit more strategic. From an integration standpoint, if you have outside systems, is that platform modern, or is that something you could look at that might give you better integration analytics, better real-time access to connecting systems across platforms and things like that? And then along that line, from an analytics standpoint, does the business have dashboards built that are easy to reference, easy to understand, or are there people in the organization that need access to that information on the go? Mobile reporting capabilities, mobile approvals, or whatever their job description might require. And then finally, just some examples around business alignment. So we talked about new ERP modules or enhancing that ERP functionality. Maybe today you're only using the base pricing functionality, you want to go to advanced pricing, or you don't do a lot with manufacturing planning and you want to look at implementing MRP. Look for ways to reduce the risk within the organization. Maybe you have some initiatives to, like I talked about, aligning or standardizing processes, and that could include rolling out a purchasing nationally that's consistent across all locations, or the introduction of a new module. Regardless of what ends up on the roadmap, in most cases, you want to end up phasing that out. You can't take on everything at once. Bryan even mentioned a 2-year roadmap. You don't want everything to start day one and not be done until year 2. So we like to recommend breaking that up into different phases. As you go down the path of this strategic roadmap, you need to allow for flexibility and potential course correction. So something might come up, a business initiative, an acquisition, something that allows you to make a change while still staying along the same path. And one of the best ways to do that is to build out that roadmap, put together some KPIs to track progress, and understand where you might be flexible should something change. The next slide I wanted to talk through shows an actual roadmap. This is an example from one of our clients, and they were on JD Edwards World. So the initial step on this roadmap was planning to come off of World. And at the beginning, it wasn't sure if they weren't certain if they were going to go to E1 because their parent company was running SAP. So ultimately, they made the decision to stick with E1. So the next step on the roadmap was that migration, which was mostly a like for like, but it brought them into a digital platform with Enterprise One running on SQL Server. Introduction of some key process improvements around payroll, and really building up a core team that could support Enterprise One going forward. And then reconnecting some integrations that existed within that world system. Once that was live, we moved into phase 2, which included some new modules, procurement, capital asset management, along with some connected devices using Orchestrator and IoT equipment that existed on their equipment that was out in the field. We were able to connect that back in and actually leverage that to help maintain and update the capital asset management module. And then finally, a phase X should really always exist, which should include a continuous improvement initiative, a continuous adoption policy around staying current with the system, and looking for ways to expand upon what's been done already. For example, more orchestrator adoption, more process automation and efficiency. And then I'll close with just how to plan for potential adjustments. So your roadmap needs to be flexible. There's no way you can say for certain what's going to be the request of the business a year, 2 years, 3 years down the road. So evaluating how these different things may impact your roadmap, whether it's a major business change. We had a customer that was in the business of supplying automotive parts to gasoline engines, and that demand has gone down as more EV vehicles are coming available, and so they're shifting their business model to something else, to where they can now supply for compressors instead of gasoline engines. So that's what would be considered a major business change. Other technologies that are disruptive, we're seeing things with blockchain and artificial intelligence that could offer brand new opportunities that didn't exist when your roadmap was built. So understanding how to introduce those to the roadmap and pivot accordingly is important. And the way to do that is by having regular review cycles, right? We don't do set it and forget it in this case. We set it and then we continue to monitor it so that we can continue to stay aligned. And that means, potentially taking an agile approach. That's a methodology that a lot of people use when executing on some of these strategic roadmaps. So flexibility and change are going to cause you to reevaluate the path that you're on. And then, there's no harm in potentially planning out some different scenarios. Maybe there's an acquisition on the horizon, but it hasn't been finalized yet. So you have a scenario that exists with and without that acquisition, making sure to address those different potential impacts as necessary. All right, so I'm going to hand it back over to Bryan.
Great, thanks, Dan. Yeah, so just to wrap us up, we're going to talk through some of the best practices for success when going through your assessment process, and then a high-level understanding of some of the new features that have come out in Release 25. So Dan, if you want to jump to the next slide. So first couple of things, right? When we think about best practices and how we like to approach these assessments, the first thing is making sure this is not an IT-driven assessment, right? You need to make sure that we are introducing people within the business and working together within IT. So that allows you to align the business process with the technology without, you from an IT perspective going in a vacuum, determining all the best ways to do things. And then maybe those don't align or fit with how the business may want to do it. And thinking about that as well, it's not just a technology overview. You're not just thinking about how things are happening within JD Edwards from a processing option perspective and your order activity rules. It's more, how is this flowing through the process from a order to cash, plan to produce, procure to pay, and how do I set up JD Edwards to be the most efficient way to facilitate that process? So it's not just about the technology, it's also about the process that is being related to that technology. Make sure when you go through, you have a clear understanding of what the objective is, right? Where you're trying to get from an end state perspective, and also what is the scope, right? So if I'm a full-fledged manufacturing organization, maybe internally we're just having major pain points in procure to pay, or plan to produce. When going through these assessments, have clear guidelines of where this assessment starts and where this assessment ends. If you broaden that too much, you end up going down rabbit holes that don't ultimately get you to that objective that you're looking for from the assessment. The last two are related to kind of keeping the assessment time boxed. So anytime we go through, and I would recommend this to anyone who does their own internal assessment, don't drag it out, right? Try and get in, do the workshops in a 1 to 2 week at most time frame, so you're not dragging out the assessment process longer than it should be. You know, a lot of times we see companies where, you know, they'll have a session once a week for 3 months. Well, that from a momentum perspective is very hard to gain any traction versus, right, just taking a couple of hours a day for a week period and knocking it out. And then lastly, just prioritize quick wins, right? That's where you're going to build momentum. You're going to allow a quick return on investment from a business process perspective, which will then give you from an IT perspective, the business will give you buy-in to, hey, we're seeing the value, right? Let's now go down the path of these medium terms. Let's now go down the path of these long terms, because we understand and can start to see visually how we are improving as an organization. So those are some of the quick things I would just keep in mind, right? Have a clear objective, make sure it's time boxed, and prioritize the quick wins so you're getting value in a quick period of time. Now, that kind of gets us through how we do assessments and some of the best practices around it. So release 25 did just come out, last year. 929 is ultimately the tools release. And the way that they break these out, when I say they, Oracle, there are kind of technology, we'll call it, or digital transformation updates on the tech side. And then there's application updates. So, every time when anyone talks about JD Edwards, they're always focusing in on the technology. But one thing I want to make sure is clear is they're still implementing new features and functions on the application side, right? How things are processed, things like AP automation or whatever that might be. But when we think about the two kind of technology updates, so there's digital transformation and system administration, which is more kind of CNC technical. So the enterprise process modeler, this is something, enterprise automation, if you've been to any of the sessions that have happened the last couple of years, whether it's been in Focus or Blueprint, enterprise automation is what you hear a lot, right? And just in this current release, they now give you the capability to use this new enterprise process modeler. So, and it's, I would highly recommend, if you have the capability, to go look at the Oracle by example, but it gives you the capability to build out what your process is in a technical view. So example, if I am running an order to cash process and my order entry starts with me putting in an order, and then it has to go through an approval process, then I have to print the paperwork, then I have to go and do my pick, pack, ship. In the process modeler, you can build out all those processes and applications, and it will automatically give you visualizations and understandings of how long each of these steps take. And maybe it gives you some view of, hey, we have a bunch of orders that are sitting at a specific status longer than they should. So it allows you to kind of build out that process modeler, which I think in the future is going to help you to get some different AI type of capabilities. From an orchestration perspective, so you now can call it from a row or form exit. So, they've been adding more and more features around this in terms of, in the past, you could only do it based on a click, and now you can add it to an E1 page, compose page. Now you're able to call these from row or form exits, which is going to be beneficial. And you can return different system values to those orchestrations too. Things like the user, what environment that you're in ultimately, what the role is, things along that nature. So you can use those for future steps in that process. Now, when we think of system admin, they've been doing lots and lots of improvements on the server manager side, allowing less time in that fat client and more time in the web interface. The development client has been simplified to where you don't need an HTML server on that client anymore, which is just increasing that process of everything kind of moving away from the fat client and moving in kind of the thin the glass ultimately. Now, then when we think about from an application perspective, I've broken these up into kind of the three different: order to cash, plan to produce, and record to report. So order to cash, a lot of this, they have added some new enterprise automation out of the box, I would call templates. So the way I like to look at these is, in the past, they did those UX1 roles where you got a bunch of watch lists and composed pages and queries and grids. Same type of thing with this enterprise automation, where out of the box, it's coming with this enterprise page that has some enterprise automation on the back end that you can then tweak based on your specific needs. They've also added some new capability around license plating. So license plating has always been kind of challenging from a visual perspective. So they added some new usability enhancements inside of that workbench. Plan to produce, same type of thing. They've added some new enterprise automation for the procure to pay side and some new enhancements around how you do your two-way voucher matching automation. And then finally, in the record to report, there's some increases in a range of the different accounts that you can do from an ID perspective. And you can assign different delinquency fees to business units on their invoices. So if someone's not paying, right, you can do delinquency fees in an automated process. So those are some of the high levels, right, when we think of release 25 and what you're going to get. I'm sure as they get to the second release of release 25, there's going to be more and more features around Orchestrator, but this is what has come out up to this point. So that's gotten us through how we run assessments, what some of the key success factors and areas you want to focus in on as you do it, what has come out in release 25. So we've got one question I see coming through. So the question is, typically, how long should these assessments take, and is it good to do them if I have? Is it good to do them on site? Yeah. So like I talked about earlier, you want to make sure to time box these assessments to where it's a 1 to 2 week activity, especially from a workshop perspective. Leading up to it and how you plan for it and do some of your fact finding, that can take a little bit longer. But your workshop should be a 1 to 2 week activity, and I always recommend doing them on site. It does. If you have multiple facilities, I would highly recommend you bring people into a single facility to where everyone's in the same room and you can communicate freely. All right, everyone. Well, thank you again for joining today, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.